afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another panel on the alternate history track. I am Cindy McLeod, your cruise director. Director. I'm sorry. And today's panel, this afternoon's panel, is Steampunk Art and Fiction with the Vandermeers. Without further ado, I shall allow everyone to introduce themselves, and thank you again for attending.
Can y'all hear me without the microphone?
You can use the mic.
No, not really.
Be on the safe side.
Hi, I'm Ann Vandermeer, one half of the Vandermeers. I'm the one with the brains and the beauty. I am the editor of Weird Tales magazine, and I also do a lot of anthologies with my husband, which we're going to be talking about. And thank you so much for coming.
Hi there, I'm G.D. Falksen. I'm an author, blogger, and public speaker and lecturer. I'm the author of a number of short fiction stories, including The Strange Case of Mr. Salad Monday, which appears in Steampunk Reloaded. And I also wrote some of the content for the Steampunk Bible. And I'm also the author of Blood in the Skies, which is my novel that just came out 2 months ago.
Howdy, I'm Stephen Segal. I worked for several years with Ann as the editorial and creative director of Weird Tales magazine. Over the past year and a half, I've been working with Quirk Books, the publishers of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, on some vaguely steampunkish things like Android Karenina and the Meowmorphosis. And I am the editor of a new book that's out now called Geek Wisdom, The Sacred Teachings of Nerd Culture.
Okay, I thought we'd start off with this first slide, which is my husband and I, train in the Czech Republic. This is the most steampunk picture of us that exists. And the thing that's really cool about this picture is that we were actually in the Czech Republic for a convention there, and our publisher took us to a beer spa. Oh yes, taking a bath in beer. It's like the best thing ever. And so this was prior to the beer spa experience, which was quite amazing. And we found this little train, and they took a bunch of pictures. So this starts us off. Okay, how this all started is that we were approached by Tachyon, and they asked us, after the success of an anthology we did called The New Weird, they asked us if we'd be interested in doing a steampunk anthology. We didn't know too much about it at the time. We were like, well, okay, sure, we'll do a steampunk anthology. We knew about the novels, we knew about K.W. Jader, Tim Powers, and James Blaylock, but we didn't know a lot about the short fiction. So we did a lot of research, and this was the first book that we did, and it came out in 2008. Little did we know that by titling the book Steampunk, that was going to be the luck for us, because at the same time that this book came out, the New York Times did an article about the whole steampunk subculture that was just booming. It just was exploding everywhere. So when people wanted to know about steampunk and they Googled steampunk, guess what came up? This book. And this book covered most of the short fiction that we could find that came out in the late 80s and 90s. So it wasn't really a lot of current stuff. But it also had a lot of nonfiction and discussion and essays on comics and movies and more things about the literature of steampunk. But we did not know at that time that there was an entire subculture around it until we were invited to a convention in 2008, also the Steampunk, what was it called? Steampunk Con. And it was where we were able to meet a lot of people, and I just fell in love with the subculture and everything about it, the music, the clothes, the art, the people, and it was so fantastic. So when they approached us to do the next one, Steampunk 2, we were very, very excited because we knew at that time that the literature and the subculture were merging, and out of it was coming some amazing, amazing short fiction. And this was a heck of a lot of fun to put together. And if you don't mind, I'm going to pass a little bit of this to some of the other people here so that I'm not hogging the mic.
Well, I guess just very simply, one of my short stories, The Strange Case of Mr. Salad Monday, appears in Steampunk 2, and it was very exciting because I got contacted by Jeff, who said, I think it was Jeff.
No, it was me.
It was you. I'm terribly sorry.
I didn't want to film your story.
I was so sorry.
That's okay.
Then I was contacted by Ann, who was very fond of The Strange Case of Mr. Salad Monday, which is very flattering, I must say. And so it appeared in the anthology, and I've got to say it's a story that I'm very proud of, and it's in such wonderful company. It is a fantastic anthology with really some wonderful big name people in there. It's absolutely great.
And as all this was happening, sort of in parallel, Ann and I were working on revamping Weird Tales, which originally was founded back in the 1920s, and published H.P. Lovecraft and Conan the Barbarian and Ray Bradbury all were in the first version of the magazine. And in recent years, it had been a little quiet. The publishing schedule had been erratic, and Ann and I came on board to try to beef it up and make it more exciting again. And so when we sat down in 2007 to figure out what we were doing, what we realized was that we wanted to merge the mission and the mandate and the sort of core essential of weird storytelling from the 20s with the sort of style and flair and je ne sais quoi of all the great writers and artists that were around right now. And in sort of merging those into one aesthetic that was trying to bridge the old and the new, what we found was that we sort of arrived at something accidentally which was very compatible with the steampunk aesthetic movement that was happening at the same time. And there was a lot of overlap in the audience we were reaching, which provided just a whole other sort of backdrop for what Ann and Jeff were doing with their explicitly steampunk work in the books.
We love to mix art with fiction, and we have a wonderful designer that we love to work with by the name of John Coulthard, and he did a lot of the book design for the Steampunk Reloaded. And this is just one of the pieces in the book. And he also did this, but he took other art and put it together to make these beautiful pieces. And this is one of the things that I love so much about steampunk, is that it's so beautiful, but it's such a mixture of a lot of different things. It's not just one thing. And putting this book together was absolutely amazing. As you can see, we also commissioned some original art. This is some art from Eric Orchard. In the book, we start off with this airship, but it's in process, where he's just starting to make it, and at the end of the book, it's complete. So that's what you have here. So one of the other things that I want to say about the steampunk subculture is that I first was introduced to it when the Weather Channel came and asked to do an interview. And I was really surprised. I thought it was kind of cool, because it's the only thing my mom knows about. If I said the Weather Channel, she would know what that is, and she would think that was cool. And when I asked them why they were approaching us and asking us for an interview for our steampunk anthologies, they said, well, for the whole ecosystem, self-sufficiency, that whole movement, which I did not even realize existed at that time. And then I began to delve more and more deeply into what steampunk was and what it could really be in the future, and I found it very, very attractive.
And actually, if I can just make a comment with regards to the fact that, we're talking about a gorgeously illustrated, well, actually all of these gorgeously illustrated books, and I think that that's something that, it's certainly something you don't see a whole lot in publishing these days, and I think it's wonderful that we're seeing it here, and I hope we see it in more books for more people in the future, because I think all of you out there probably agree, it's really nice seeing beautiful pictures along with the text. It really adds context as well. So I just wanted to give actually a big round of applause for having the ingenuity of doing that.
This piece of art here is from a Russian artist whose name escapes me. I apologize for not being able to pronounce his name. But this is for this bizarre, whacked-out story that my husband wrote with about 10 other people, and he put it in the back of Steampunk Reloaded and called it The Secret History of Steampunk. For some reason, my husband really loves to have secrets about everything, but yet he tells you everything. Okay, this is going to be a lead-in to the newest book that we have right now. The newest book is the Thackeray T. Lambshead Cabinet of Curiosities. But before we did that book, we did the Thackeray T. Lambshead Pocket Guide to Eccentric and Discredited Diseases, because we like really, really long titles. But this book was just basically a book of fake diseases that was around the theme of this Dr. Lambshead, who traveled around the world. He died in 2003 at the age of 103. And we were very fortunate to have a lot of people join us in this adventure. We had 64 contributors, and that includes artists, book designers, and writers.
The Pocket Guide is one of the funniest books you will ever read. Go find a copy. It is a gift that keeps on giving. You can't read it quickly. You can read it in small parts to make it last a long time. If I could recommend one book to make you laugh, that would be the one.
And that brings us to the Cabinet of Curiosities. The premise of this book, because we did not want to do part 2, another book of diseases, is we determined that as Lamb's Head was traveling around the world, he was picking up these little artifacts, or people were sending him things, because a lot of people send him stuff. And we were able to commission some fantastic artists and writers to help us in this adventure. And here's the cover. And then again, we were lucky to have John Colthart once more do some more of the designs. And these are the section dividers of art, because again, we like to have the art. This is actually a piece of art from Jan Spunkmeyer, who is a Czech filmmaker and animator. And we were lucky enough, that same trip where you saw us on the little train, we were able to pick this up, and he allowed us to use it in the cabinet. I mean, this definitely looks like something that would come from a Cabinet of Curiosities. And this was really cool because we approached Mike Mignola to do art for us, and he gave us 4 original pieces. And he said, I would really, really, really like Michael Moorcock to write a story to one of them. And so Michael Moorcock said, sure, why not? And he wrote a story about a missionary who decided that the best way for him to do what he needed to do was to have himself miniaturized and then injected into the bloodstream of heathens so that he could convert them on a cellular level. Well, needless to say, this did not turn out well. And this is a piece from J.K. Potter. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with his work. He's done most of his work in dark fantasy. But we asked him if he was interested in joining us in this project, and he sent us this beautiful image. And so we asked him, well, how long did it take you to put this together? And he said, what are you talking about? This is just a shelf in my room.
And can you mention some of the remarkable list of writers who contribute to the 2 Thackeray books?
Well, let's see, a lot of the people in the first book were in the second book, but in the first book we had Neil Gaiman, and that's what really made it into this huge explosion, is that he wanted to get in on it, and he invited a lot of his friends. In the new book right now, we've got, excuse me a second, we've got Holly Black, Greg Broadmoor, we've got Ted Chiang, Lev Grossman, China Mieville, Mike Mignola, of course, and Mike Moorcock. We have Alan Moore, Garth Nix, Naomi Novik, Helen Oyemi, Sherry Priest, Carrie Vaughn, and tons more. This particular book actually has 84 contributors, because, you know, it wasn't supposed to have 84, but all our projects have scope creep. Now, this image right here is something that we commissioned from Aaron Alfrey, again, another artist who does a lot of stuff in the dark world. But he did this to go along with a story that was already written by Michael Sisko, one of my favorite writers. You can't have a Cabinet of Curiosities unless you have the thing in a jar, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, but in this case, we decided to turn it completely around, and the thing in the jar was something from a European culture that an African anthropologist found. And so that's what made this story really cool. And then, of course, we like to play around with this. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with Sam Van Offlen. His artwork, he's a French artist, his artwork is kind of more on the edge of diesel punk as opposed to steampunk. And so this is some of his art. And then this art right here on the right, there's a piece of artwork. I bet you all didn't know that China Mieville was an artist. Well, he is. And so that's the gallows horse. And then the other side is the bear that comes from the bear gun, which we can talk about more later. And then this is a piece of art from Ivica Stevanovic, which is he's a Serbian artist who illustrated the story that Jeffrey Ford wrote. And his story is called The Relic, and it's about a foot, as you can see, supposedly from a saint, and the stories behind that. And then we also have this piece of art, I don't know if you can tell from this picture, that it looks like this rotund gentleman that has a parrot on either shoulder looking at what can only be described as a large singing fish. And this is a piece of art that I think it came from some editorial cartoon many years ago. John Coulthard brought it to our attention, and we really wanted to use it. So finally, we sent this to Amal El-Multar, up-and-coming writer, and asked her if she would write a story around this image, and she's like, sure. So about a week later, we come back to her and say, well, how about if you could add in a frog pulling a cart with another frog on it? Can you add that in there too? And she's like, sure, why not? This is also another piece from that Russian artist that I was telling you about that had the duck from The Secret History. This is another one of his pieces. We love mechanical animals, and this is a mechanical fish. Okay, now we're in the Steampunk Bible. This is the cover of the Steampunk Bible that my husband did along with S.J. Chambers, and the cover is based on a design of an old Jules Verne novel, and I'm going to let other people talk.
You know, that sort of sampling of material from the Captain of Curiosities is really the perfect example of why working with Ann and also with Jeff is one of the great creative joys of my life, because you know, it's very easy to do a passable job as an editor of stuff, because there's lots of places out there where people are putting things in your face all the time. And it's very easy to just look at what's in your face, pick stuff that you think is cool, and plop it out there, and bang, you edit something. That's not what Ann and Jeff do. Ann and Jeff read and view everything from all over the world all the time. When they finally put something in a book and give it to you, you can be assured that you're going to discover creators you've never heard of, from parts of the world you've probably never heard of, doing work that is unlike what you're used to seeing in the regular media channels that we get exposed to. And that's really what makes the book special.
This image right here is from the beginning of the book, and this is called the Steampunk Treehouse. And I apologize, I don't know who built it, but I think it's pretty damn awesome. And that picture itself, that image, I mean, that's an actual photograph. That's not photoshopped or anything. That's an actual place.
And can you back up just a second and sort of describe the general scope and mandate of the Steampunk Bible from the start?
The Steampunk Bible, the idea behind it was to try to explore all aspects of steampunk, coming from all different points of views and perspectives. And it was a very exhaustive research project, because coming to it from the outside looking in, you had to really get a lot of assistance from a lot of people to point you in the right directions. And the other thing was trying to find all the right images. I know that my husband pulled together probably 3 or 4 times more than he could possibly fit into one book. He was limited into what he could do, because the publishers, of course, they're not going to do a 2,000-page book. And if he had had his druthers, it would have been multiple volumes. It would have been the encyclopedia of steampunk instead of the Steampunk Bible. But he was limited in what he was able to do, so he tried to find those things that were going to be at the fore and those things that were going to be the most interesting, that would pull people in. The book was really created to tell the world about steampunk. It wasn't really written for the insiders as much as it was written for people that don't know anything about it, to let them know something about it. I think that was the main scope of the project.
And to give you an idea of the kind of range of material that was being looked at, when I first got contacted to contribute to it, I was actually asked to reproduce a rundown article that I had done on multicultural steampunk, which is basically steampunk from non-European, non-American, non-Western cultures, which is something that one of the subjects in steampunk that I've known for working with over the past several years. And then after going back and forth with regards to that, I then got asked to do other material, including things such as meetups and gatherings, conventions related to steampunk and so forth. So there's just really a whole range of different topics that are appearing here. It's not one specific focus.
And of course, the book starts off with the history of the precursors to the steampunk movement. You can't do that without Jules Verne. And we thought that this image was absolutely gorgeous. K.W. Jader, the one that coined the term steampunk, I think it was in 1987 in a letter to Locus. His first novel that you could consider a steampunk novel was this one, Morlock Night. This is a reissue, and it's, believe it or not, John Coulthard who did this cover. But the novel that he's most known for is Infernal Devices. But this was the first. And you can't have steampunk unless you have an exploding submarine, right? Steampunk comics.
Well, and actually, specifically on the topic of this one, this is from Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. This is actually the 1901 one, which is a more recent version of it. But the original League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which was, I think that was the late 90s when it came out, was really one of the first examples of steampunk in comics, and it was one of the contributing factors to a sort of regrowth and resurgence in an interest in steampunk that occurred in the early mid-2000s.
And these are ray guns. This is the Weta Workshop, and these are all the ray guns from Greg Broadmoor. Greg Broadmoor is the one that's also responsible for a lot of the design of the Lord of the Rings sets. But he does these, what's that guy's name?
Oh, the Dr. Lordberg.
Talk about that, 'cause I can't remember that guy's name.
I think it's Dr. Board. But yeah, they've got this whole. If you're not familiar with the Weta ray guns, they have this whole little sub mythology around them, following this sort of classic Challenger or Doc Savage-esque pulp hero who runs around and uses them and fights Martians and Venusians and hunts dinosaurs. And I think they actually have come out with a comic book sort of condensing all of the material. And it's really worth looking at. I mean, the props are fantastic, and then the story they've developed for it really is just a lot of fun. It is very much like a classic pulp adventure story.
Girl Genius. I think you all are familiar with this, right?
Oh,
And actually, I want to make a quick note with regards to Girl Genius. Girl Genius, for anyone who wears goggles on a hat, Girl Genius is patient zero. Before Phil was doing, did the comic, drawing characters that had goggles on hats, no one was doing that. As soon as he started doing that, and specifically as soon as Girl Genius turned into a webcomic, so it was much more accessible to people started doing it. So you can blame him or thank him depending on your stance. But the Girl Genius and the Folios really are a crucial aspect of the resurgence of an interest in steampunk in the 2000s.
Does anybody recognize this? This is Forevertron Park. I believe it's in Wisconsin. Dr. Evermore, that's his steampunk name. But this is an ex-engineer. When he retired, what he wanted to do, and this is another one of the things that I love so much about steampunk, is he took all of this discarded technology and turned it into something beautiful. So he's actually got some NASA space junk in there. He's got stuff from nuclear reactors. He's got all kinds of stuff in there, and he made this amazing piece of art in this huge park. And as far as I know, I think it's free. Anyone can go. But,
What's the name of it?
Forevertron Park. That's what he calls it.
It's kind of great. There are a few places like this dotted around the country. There's, if you're driving up in Washington State and coming south from the Seattle area, right as you pass Mount Rainier on, I believe it's Route 706, there's this popping up out of nowhere, a little sculpture garden, because it's not little at all. It's what has been someone's personal property turned into this giant expo of rusting metal brilliance. It's sort of quietly steampunkish, hovering in the shadow of a mountain. It's an artist named Dan Clennard, and I think the space is called Ex Nihilo Park, and it's not quite as cohesive as this one over here, but there's just a remarkable range of different sorts of steampunk aesthetics built into all this stuff. There's something glorious about the fact that this is you know, an aesthetic movement that spans people coming from all different traditions and all different backgrounds of art. You know, wherever they start, you know, right now there's something taking them to this place.
And it's also the idea that people want to be able to put their hands on something and make it with their own hands, because the way that our modern world is, we're so far removed from the things that we create that this allows us to go back to being creators and inventors and being able to use our brains to put together something brand new, even if we're using old technologies, discarded, recycling. I think that's the beauty of it, we're taking all these things and making them into something new. Speaking of which, this is a church tank. Taking two things and putting them together, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. This is Chris Cuxey is an artist. I believe he lives in Colorado, but I could be wrong. But he makes these amazing, gigantic sculptures, and this particular one is called Church Tank.
Why? Don't see it.
Over here we have one of the beetles from Mike Libby. His beetles are actually, his clockwork beetles are all over the world. My husband and I saw them when we were in Amsterdam visiting my daughter in a shop. It was really cool. And next to that you also see, and excuse me because my French is horrible, the Machine de Nantes. There's like a little island off of Nantes that has this place where they make these gigantic steampunky mechanical animals, and they actually have a gigantic elephant that you're going to see in just a minute.
Given the way DragonCon works, I expect now that Ann is, oh, I'm not going to step on that. I'll be quiet. I was going to say, given that you've now seen the Steampunk Beatles, I expect next year someone will be dressed in Steampunk George, John, Ringo, and Paul.
You're a horrible person, Stephen. Stop giving them ideas.
Back to the elephant.
Okay, this is the actual mechanical elephant that they make there in Nantes. And you can see, I don't know if you can see the people that are there. You can see how large it is. In the front there's a little glass area where the driver is. But if you're walking down the street and you see something this large coming down at you, it's really quite a surprise. But the thing that's most amusing about this piece that I love so much is that the way to get inside the elephant is through an entranceway in the back of under his tail. This is my husband's favorite picture in the entire book, and I'm going to let other people talk about it.
This was a photograph from DragonCon 2 years ago, and this was actually at the end of it was a couple-hour-long photo shoot that we did. You might be able to recognize me up there in the corner. And then, of course, Evelyn Creek is down there on the bottom. You're probably familiar with her. And good old Anthony down on the right hand or the left-hand side. It was this really fantastic image that was done just sort of as a final thought, as a, hey, let me try this out, by the photographer who I think was Jesse Nobles, who was extremely talented. And it's such a fun image. And I really think it just kind of captures the range of visual styles that you can find in steampunk. You've got aristocrat looks, you've got sort of the adventure and gentleman look, you've got the ragamuffin, you've got the frontiersman, and Evelyn down there on the bottom is wearing actually one of the uniform coats from the Wild Wild West film. It's just, I think it's a wonderful image.
This right here also gives you a lot of the range of styles that you see in steampunk fashion. And you have, I think that's Evelyn in that upper, yes, and Libby Bullock down underneath her, and then, I can't remember that guy's.
Yeah, so that's Evelyn up on the upper right hand, and then down in the lower left hand, that is Kit Stolen, who's also known by the handle of Anachronaut, who actually, a little tidbit, he is arguably patient zero for the steampunk fashion style because he was, back in the late 90s in New York, he was going around the club scene dressed exactly like that, wearing these classic Victorian clothes, and then these very sort of cyber high-tech hair falls that he actually made himself. The guy was a theater arts student, and he's a very talented tailor. And people would go around asking him, what are you doing? What is this? This is obviously not, cyber goth or anything like that. He's like, oh, well, fine, it's steampunk. There you go. And really, kind of like with the coining of the term steampunk, it's this sort of off-the-cuff answer to a question that you never really expect to take off. And people are all of a sudden like, oh my God, that's amazing, I want to do that too. And now we've got to the point where, people are doing it in massive numbers. It's wonderful, but he is very talented. I recommend looking up more photos of him and looking up his work. He's just incredible.
And this is Jake von Slack of the Steampunk Workshop with one of his inventions. Not all of his inventions actually do anything. I think this one just makes sparks, but it's pretty cool. The thing that's really cool about Jake is he's just, his real name is Sean Slattery. He's just a regular guy, but he likes to tinker. And he started off by just doing tinkering and making things, and then all of a sudden the steampunk explosion happened, and all of a sudden people were paying attention to what he was doing. So he was asked to do a photo spread for this Italian magazine, and they wanted him to look a little bit more, not steampunkish, but more, kind of European model male kind of thing. So there's that picture of, that's not what he looks like normally, but that's how they made him look in that. And then these other two gentlemen over here, that's just a very cool picture. I think you know those people.
Yeah, it's the gentleman higher up on the steps is goes by the name Anthony LaGrange, and the gentleman who's lower down, I do not remember his name, and I feel horrible. Yes, that's right. Say it again.
Mark Curtis.
Mark Curtis. Yes, who's the cousin of William, who's the husband of our wonderful track director. And that's actually from the same photo shoot as that sort of large double page photo. And we had so many wonderful people there. And as you can see, they've got two entirely different aesthetic styles, but they blend so well. It's a wonderful, wonderful photo. And I like the fact that you have Anthony doing the very sort of slimmed down, low tech, low gadget style. He looks like he could have, with the exception of course, it looks like he could have just stepped out of a historical picture. And then you've got Mark, who's got a much more high tech gadget type style. And really does show the range. Steampunk really does go from minimal technology up to heavy duty technology. It really just goes both ways, and it's just fantastic.
This is just kind of cool because it's had a little touch of the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds thing going on there, because a lot of people look at H.G. Wells' work as a precursor to our current steampunk as well. So with this, we were looking towards the future, is what's going to be the future of steampunk. And here's another mechanical elephant, just because my husband loves it so much. Okay, so Judy was talking a little bit about multiculturalism in steampunk, and steampunk really is all around the world now. It's not just this sort of Victorian, UK, Wild Wild West, US frontier kind of thing. It's spread all over. This is an airship. This is a Chinese airship by James Ng, and it's actually in the book. Here's the original, because it's all about how you make it. And then here's the finish.
He is a very talented artist. He's got a whole range of these drawings where he's sort of exploring what a Chinese take on steampunk would look like. And he's just got this, he's got a Chinese style steampunk robot. He's got the Empress Cixi as this sort of massive, tyrannical supervillain type figure. And it's just, I highly recommend checking his work out. He's very talented. It's such a beautiful take on steampunk in using a cultural aesthetic style that we're not as familiar with. It's terrific.
So that's the end of the slideshow, and I think we can probably open this up to questions.
Yes.
This question is primarily directed toward Dan, but I think all of you did do it. At the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how sort of the sorry, I'm a little worried because I live in Milwaukee now, and with the viruses and some of the machines and some of the boundary disturbing that steampunk does. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think, or in what ways is steampunk sort of disturbing the boundary between the animate and the inanimate? It seems to be one of our last boundaries that we've had.
You're talking about when creators are making mechanical elephants and biological types of things like that? Well, you know, I don't know if that's just solely a steampunk thing, because I think that's always been there in the genre with robots and automata. And I think people have always been fascinated by that because it is another act of creation, but it's almost like you're creating life without having to have a baby. And I think that, you know, this is just my supposition, and I could be totally off base, but I think that there's a desire for people to replicate themselves in some way and to maybe do it better, maybe make something better. So maybe that's where that's going, to see if they can play God, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that, and you're quite right. It is something that you see in steampunk, but it's not confined to it. Actually, if you go all the way back to the early modern period, back in the 16th, 17th century, there are these wonderful automata which are designed to look like animals or little scenes with figures that, because of the clockworks involved, you know, this is long before you would start considering this a base for steampunk. This is way back in the Renaissance and post-Renaissance period. They have things that look perfectly real and mimic the actual movements and stylings and life of animals. And there are these little clockworks which are designed to mimic these things for the delight of the aristocracy. And it really is, I think, something that you see throughout all of human history. People are just fascinated by the concept of being able to take something from nature and reproduce it themselves. And it's not necessarily trying to play God, but it's trying to sort of wrestle with the concept of what is man-made and what is natural, and where is that dividing line. And actually, for the questioner, can I ask a question? Well, are you wearing a green carnation?
I am.
I would like to say bravo.
Thank you.
It's the question also, I think, points out something interesting that's happening, which is the fact that very familiar and very old science fiction tropes that we've been seeing for decades and decades are being reinterpreted and represented through specifically steampunk in a way that, kind of ironically, by virtue of making them look more old-fashioned, is having them strike us as new again. And I think in the case of this particular issue, where you're talking about, you know, the hybridization of the human and the mechanical, the human and the artificial, I think one of the reasons is, you know, in real time here, you know, in the present, and in science fiction of our future that we're used to, you know, the artificial is becoming more and more invisible, you know, as plastics are sophisticated and we're, you know, breeding biological, you know, machinery in the lab. I think the artificiality of things is better and better masked. And I think what steampunk does, by putting the gears on the outside again, is actually reminding us that despite all of the advances in technology we enjoy now, and despite what we picture for the future, this stuff still is artificial, and there still is this strange, unnatural relationship. And it's easier to see that way.
I think I'm going to got a kind of nebulous question comment, so I'm going to approach it from a sort of hostile way. So pardon me, but
that sounds like fun.
I kind of take offense of the idea of a patient zero for steampunk, because, for instance, if you want to talk about goggles on hats, well, you know, if a lot of us were Nephilim goths and we were doing goggles, cowboy hats, and cybernetic hands in the 80s, you know. So I mean, it's. The thing about steampunk itself, the term was coined in the 80s, and I'll get to the thing, so let me get, it's this roundabout thing. And you know, you can read real steampunk written in the 70s by Moorcock, you know, where you've got all these elements with his, known as the time stream stuff. So, but what I wanted to get at, what seems really interesting is, it feels like we're actually living in some ways in Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age, and that this is the neo-Victorian thing. And that a lot of this realization of this ancient technology, like the Victorian laptops, requires our technology to get to a point where it only becomes impressive to us when it's handmade again, which is his whole idea with the Vikings and the resurgence of handmade in a world where you can just push a button and get, there's your car. You know, and I wonder about sort of explore that idea of the fact that we're now, you know, and one comment and I'll turn to you, but William Gibson said he had to stop writing science fiction because it's now history. You know, all of his science fiction that he wrote, he considers that past. He kicks himself for missing cell phones in Neuromancer. So, you know, this idea that we may be living in the Diamond Age in some ways with this subculture.
No, I think that's actually a very good point. And one thing that I usually talk about when I do lectures on steampunk is that steampunk is really tied into a much larger neo-vintage trend. We are looking back to the past, and to the styles and technology and the aesthetic of the past, because it is different and it's new and exciting. In some ways, it's a rebellion. And
it's handmade.
Well, exactly, that's the thing. It's a rebellion against the sort of homogenization of technology. It's a rebellion against the iPod culture, where everything is ultra modern, ultra sleek. You don't see any of the working parts. You don't see any of the craftsmanship. I mean, back in the 19th century, when they were making, you know, steam engines and factory machinery, they were putting engravings on them of these pastoral scenes or these industrial scenes, because they, you know, even though they were, you know, large-scale producing these, they still wanted them to have a unique feel. You know, everyone who had a pocket watch would usually have it engraved or that had some kind of image on it. It was something you hold, you pass down. And so really there's this appreciation of technology as not just what it can do, but what goes into it, how it's made, how it works. And that, I think, is part of the really big appeal of steampunk, that you can actually dig into this industrial age style technology where you actually can understand how it works together. It's not all circuits, it's actually moving parts. It's gears and pistons and levers and so forth. And that, I think, really fascinates people, and I think that's part of the appeal of steampunk, that it's making it, it's not necessarily making it more accessible, because there's still a lot of, I guess, learning you have to do to be able to produce it, but it makes it more comprehensible. It's easier to understand, and I mean that in a positive way. It doesn't make it simple, but it makes it engaging in a different way because you can understand it, you can see the detail.
A couple weeks ago at Worldcon, I was privately involved in a small group ferocious argument with three of us debating one very smart, very well-loved science fiction author who I won't name, but ironically he writes time travel stories, among other things. So you wouldn't expect this, but he was telling us how he hates steampunk. He thinks it's the worst thing that could ever happen to science fiction because it's the opposite of science fiction. Because the way he sees it, steampunk is about people being afraid of the future and running nostalgically to escape it into the past. And that's the opposite of everything science fiction is about. And what I was trying to get him to turn around and recognize was that, sure, it is about turning around to the past, but it's not about running away. Or at least it's not fundamentally about running away. It's about recognizing that there are things happening as we move into the future that we're totally not cool with, like this homogenized approach to making the world around us. You know, look at architecture. Look at new buildings that are built today. They're not good to be in. They're not good to walk past.
They're not human.
They're not human. You know, you walk through a city like, you know, downtown Atlanta and see the kinds of buildings that were going up 150 years ago, and you remember the way we used to want to create the world, and we don't now. And I think what we're seeing in part with steampunk is people saying, you know what, the future is headed someplace that is absolutely wrong in these certain ways, many of which are aesthetic, many of which are, you know, creative-based. And in order to try to head that off, let's take a step back, remember a point at which stuff was, aesthetically speaking, creatively speaking, kind of awesome, even if the whole world wasn't, and find the bits from here that we want to sort of jumpstart and move forward with again from a better place. He didn't see that, but I think it's valid.
And yet he does time travel stories. Okay.
Well, and to tie that back to one of your earlier points, I think it also goes into the ability to be able to see something somebody made as opposed to this one device was made by 3,000 devices made by 10 million people. The ability to go, this shirt, my neighbor made.
And genealogy.
I think there's a lot of that too.
It's a genealogy of property.
And that also goes back to what we did with the cabinet, is that you have, I'm saying again, the secret life of objects, that every single artifact in Lamb's Head's cabinet has a story behind it.
Yeah.
And I think people like that. I mean, you walk into someone's house and you see something on their mantle and you say, tell me about that, and they tell you the whole story about it, where it came from, who had it first, who made it. That's really interesting. But you walk in there and you see somebody's iPod, well, big deal, you know, or their flat screen TV. There's no story behind that. But I do think that people like to tell stories. I think that's the whole reason why we're all here, is we like to tell stories to each other. And if we want to tell a story about an object, that's even better, you know. And that's how we communicate our feelings and our emotions and our past and our future and where we want to go, our hopes and dreams. They're all tied up in these things. And okay, maybe that's a little bit too materialistic, that we have too many things, but each individual item that we have does have a history. You know, this came from my grandmother, this used to belong to my son, and I still have it. Things like that mean something, and I think that that's another appeal.
I'd like to talk about how the pendulum swings from the pathos to the ethos, and the Romantic era was the era of pathos. And when we shifted to the 20th century, it became the era of ethos. And so all of the architecture and music and the art became kind of scientific and mathematical and cerebral, instead of being romantic and of the heart like the 19th century. But the beauty of this is that the pendulum is swinging in the 21st century back to the pathos, to the neo-romantic, to the Aquarian and the heart. And so the music and the architecture should be shifting towards a more beautiful aesthetic. And I'm hoping that this wave is going to start cresting as we get further into the 21st century.
It would be wonderful if the two sides could work together.
First of all, I love the Steampunk Bible. It's really great. There was one area that I was expecting to see and didn't, and I don't know if it was left on the cutting room floor and would maybe make the encyclopedia, or, but that's gaming, both role-playing games and video games. There's a fair amount of steampunk culture in both of those, maybe even more so than in the movies. And so I was wondering if you knew if there had been any work done, sort of in that area.
Well, I know, like you said, we couldn't put everything in the Bible, and Jeff and Selena put together a website, and that's where they're trying to put anything that couldn't make it or any overflow. And I think that GD can talk about games, because I know he's very involved in it.
Yeah, and actually that was Steampunk Games was one of the topics that I did speak to Jeff about, but it's at the time, I think part of the reason why it was left out at the time of when the book was compiled, because of course there's a length of time between when the finished piece goes to the publisher and when it becomes available. There weren't as many wholly or primarily steampunk games as there are now, and as there especially will be in the next few years. I mean, let's face it, you've got Bungie coming out with a specifically designed steampunk game this year, I think. So it is going to explode. But you certainly do have a history of steampunk in certain games. You have Arcanum, which is probably the best example, that basically takes the idea of a traditional high fantasy world and creates an industrial revolution, which I think is just one of the most fantastic ideas I've ever seen. But you have other types of games that have wrestled with this. And so I think there is lots of material there. Blizzard's Warcraft setting, going really all the way back to Warcraft 2, has wrestled with these concepts of industrial technology. But
Fable.
Yeah, Fable.
Space 1889.
Exactly. But part of the situation, I think, is that in many of these, not all of them, because Space 1889, of course, is a perfect example of straightforward steampunk, just like Deadlands, for example. Part of the issue is that, especially with video games, a lot of them take aspects of steampunk, aspects of the aesthetic of the technology and so forth, and put them down into another genres setting, and this is generally you're putting steampunk aspects into a fantasy setting. And so you don't have as many dedicated steampunk games until now. I mean, I'm the lead writer for Air by Hypo Studios, which is a specifically designed steampunk game that is coming out next year. And like I said, you have Bungie. You're going to be seeing large numbers of other companies coming out with specifically engineered steampunk games. And so I would assume that if there would be a follow-up or on the website for the Steampunk Bible, that kind of material would get addressed. Because in the next, I'd say, 2 years, there's going to be probably enough material for a book specifically devoted to steampunk-themed games. Not simply just a chapter in another book. But at the time when the Bible was being put together, I don't think that Jeff necessarily thought there was quite enough material. I would assume that was the reason.
Could you take a moment to talk about your upcoming projects? Will there be a published Steampunk Anthology 3? Is there going to be a Steampunk Apocrypha?
Well, to be honest, I think my husband is steampunked out because he spent the last couple of years so much involved in it. He really wants to get back to writing his own fiction, and that's what he's doing right now. I have not closed the door on that, and I might very well do something in the future with steampunk. I might do a Steampunk 3, but if I did, I'd be doing it on my own because he's taken away. As far as upcoming project, my husband and I just finished the final proof pages of this 1,200-page anthology that's coming out in October. And it's not steampunk, it's called The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories. And it chronicles the past 100 years of weird fiction starting in 1908 up to 2010. So it's actually more than 100 years. And it's got over 110 writers in it, and I think it's about 116 stories. So that's the new project that's coming out in October.
And the weird is actually something that steampunk fans ought to enjoy a lot because there's a great deal of overlap as far as weird fiction being material that tends to include disparate elements that are in part fantastical, in part science fictional, in part horrific. And obviously steampunk is built on a great deal of not only cross-time but cross-genre pollination. So I think there's a lot of overlap that people can kick out of.
Yeah, and also on that note, I mean, a lot of weird fiction does deal with sci-fi. Of course, steampunk is sci-fi. And also weird fiction, a lot of it looks back to 19th century authors like Edgar Allan Poe, who also wrote steampunk fiction. It's not well known, but he did deal with the science fiction of his day. So there definitely is a lot of cross-genre appeal, I would say.
Well, and even the most obvious thing that we might not have explicitly been clear is that the range of stories included in this book goes back to what time frame?
1908.
So it's a lot of sort of primary sources for this stuff.
There was a gentleman, I think, behind the man who just spoke. Yes.
Sorry. A comment and a question, I guess. The comment, it seems like a lot of what's going on in steampunk seems to be happening in other, there's going to be other cultural trends that are kind of trying to do the same thing of kind of looking backwards to go forward. I know in locally here, and it's not quite locally, there's a sort of a movement called Afrofuturism that's kind of trying to do the same thing, and trying to find aspects of African culture and the experience of African American folks in the diaspora, and kind of sort of create a future that seems to be more grounded, I guess, that seems to make more sense. So to me, I kind of see kind of the steampunk movement kind of trying to do the same thing in terms of aesthetics, and I guess even in terms of sort of redefining culture. The question I had was, the other intersecting trend here also seems to be with the maker movement. The interest, the resurging interest in actually building things. And I'm kind of curious to see people's takes on the idea to what extent the steampunk culture and the maker movement are kind of carrying each other along, and at what point is one going to kind of really assimilate the other?
Well, here's the thing with that. The two are actually, they're actually two distinct movements, and they don't directly cross over, but I'm going to explain that in a moment. So I think they're going to continue on in their own courses, completely independent. But I think part of the reason why a lot of people mistake steampunk or having connections to maker culture is because what steampunk really has is an emphasis on craftsmanship, an emphasis on the idea that you understand how to make these things, whether it's clothing, or gadgetry, or what have you. You really take the time to figure it out, to make it good, to make it high quality. And that's something that I think maker culture does as well. It's just that I think the emphasis for each of them is different. Maker culture is about learning how to do it to be self-sufficient. And while there are certainly lots of steampunk enthusiasts who like to learn how to make their own clothes or make their own props so that they can be self-sufficient as well, I think really the driving goal there is to get back to this sort of classic early 19th century, pre-19th century, pre-industrial concept of craftsmanship, where you have, back in the days of the guild artisans, where you would take the time to make something that's really high quality, to make something that is really good, it's really nice, it's going to last. And that is part of the whole neo-vintage thing, getting back to the idea of a time before modern day, when things really were designed to suit the people who had them. Like with clothing, back in the vintage periods, clothing was designed to fit a person, not a person to fit clothing. And so, like I said, I can see why you would see the similarities, because they do both highly value craftsmanship and the ability of individuals to produce things. But for example, I think in maker culture, the idea of a maker making something and then another person buying it is kind of not what they're about. Whereas in steampunk, one of the great things about steampunk is that because it's coming out of an artist movement, there is a lot of support for professional craftspeople, small businesses and individuals who, whether they make clothing, whether they make the props or the gadgets, whether they're writers or whatnot, people want to support them. They want to support the arts involved. And so if a person who is a fan of steampunk can't make their own clothes, or can't draw their own stuff, or can't make their own gadgets, there's no stigma to that. There's no stigma to buying it, so long as you're supporting one of the artists in the movement. So I think that answers the question.
I'd like to argue that while these may well be two separate subcultures that rose in parallel and don't necessarily cross as often as it looks like, nonetheless, I go back to what you said and suggest there is something more important that unifies them rather than not, and it ties into the sort of social remixing that you're talking about in the first place, which is the idea that they're both, I think, fundamentally about fighting back against the modern conception of all of us, first and foremost, as mass consumers. They're both very much a reaction to that, and slightly different ways of responding. But I think that's because some of us are artists first, some of us are patrons first, some of us are scientists and engineers first. And so I think everyone finds their own home and their own specific sub-tribe and their own way to deal with that stuff. But I think it all very much comes from that. That impulse to say, no, I am not just here to buy things within the factory.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. It is very much an issue of rejecting the sort of homogenization and compartmentalization of society, and getting back to a time where people could be more fluid in what they did, and come to appreciate things that have life, that have character. Like Ann was talking about, the secret life of objects, getting back into the vibrancy of things and having uniqueness to them.
I would say, to tie it back to something Ann said earlier, we need to be honest with ourselves, and this is where I sympathize a little bit with the writer I was arguing with. It's wonderful to want to hire an artist to make a uniquely modded handcrafts made case for our smartphone, to make a statement about things. But let's recognize that while our iPhone or our BlackBerry might not have the sort of personal story that Ann was talking about artifacts having, it does indeed have a human story behind it. The human story behind my iPhone is that there's a factory in China where young people are underpaid and they throw themselves out of the building and kill themselves because it's so terrible. So we should think about that before we buy the next one and before we decide that we're very cool for putting gear
I want to thank all of you for coming out and being such a wonderful audience with great questions and paying close attention to what we had to say. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you to